The wind came from the northwest that morning, cold and indifferent, carrying with it the smell of dry earth and something older, the kind of smell that belonged to places where too many men had already died. The demonstration range sat at the foot of a low mountain ridge, a long corridor of scorched ground that the military had been using for 30 years to prove things to people who needed things proven. The bleachers were temporary, bolted aluminum frames draped with olive canvas, and they held roughly 40 men, generals, colonels, defense contractors in civilian clothes who wore their wealth quietly, in the cut of their jackets and the stillness of their hands. A few foreign observers sat to one side, notebooks open, pens idle. Everyone had come to see what the new long-range platform could do. Everyone had come believing they already knew the answer. The target was 4,000 meters away. In practical terms, that meant it was invisible to the naked eye. You had to find it through a spotting scope to even confirm it existed. A steel silhouette the size of a seated human figure, anchored into a distant hillside at the far end of the corridor. Most men who understood ballistics understood what 4,000 meters meant. It meant the bullet would travel for more than 4 seconds after leaving the barrel. It meant the shooter had to account for the Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth itself, the way gravity curves everything downward, and the way wind does not blow in one single direction for 4 full seconds. It meant that by the time the round arrived at its destination, the person who fired it had already been waiting, already breathing, already holding the world as still as a human being could hold it. 13 men had already tried. 13 times the range had gone quiet. 13 times a spotter had watched through glass. 13 times the radio crackled with the same flat word, miss. Some had come close. One round had struck the steel post the target was mounted on, which produced a brief, polite discussion among the observers about whether proximity should count for anything in warfare. It was decided, without much ceremony, that it did not. General Harlan Voss stood at the edge of the range with his hands clasped behind his back. He was 61 years old, a man built from 4 decades of institutional gravity. His face had the quality of old stone, not cruel exactly, but worn into a specific permanent expression that said he had seen most things and found most of them adequate at best. He had commanded divisions in 2 different theaters. He had buried people he loved. He had made decisions that cost lives, and then made more decisions, and then come home and learned to sleep again, which was perhaps the most honest thing you could say about a man like him. He was not impatient. That would have been too emotional. He was simply finished being impressed by the spectacle of failure. He turned to the range officer beside him, a young colonel named Dre who had the posture of a man constantly auditioning for a higher rank. 13 shots, Voss said. It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was simply the number placed in the air between them like a stone. Yes, sir, Dre said. At 4,000 meters. Yes, sir. Voss looked back down the corridor of dead ground. Who's left on the roster? There was a pause, the kind that carries weight, the kind that happens when the person holding the answer is not entirely sure the answer will be well received. 1, Dre said. She was added to the list late, local auxiliary, a volunteer program, sir. She technically qualified under the range certification requirements, which is why she's on the roster at all. I wouldn't have, she, Voss said. Yes, sir. The word sat there. Voss didn't react to it, not visibly. But the assembled observers shifted in their seats the way people shift, when they sense something is about to become either remarkable or embarrassing. Her name was Mara Venn. She was 44 years old, which is a number that carries its own kind of silence in military spaces, where youth is often worn like a credential. She had not worn a uniform in more than a decade. The clothes she wore now were plain, a dark jacket over a thermal layer, worn trousers, boots that had been resoled twice. She carried herself without performance, not meek, not aggressive, just present the way a stone is present in a field, without apology, without announcement. She had driven 3 hours that morning in a truck that had seen better winters, arriving at the range before dawn, because she was the kind of person who arrived places before dawn. Not because anyone told her to, because lateness felt to her like a kind of disrespect, and she had too much respect for mornings to waste them. What almost no one on the range knew, because she had not offered it and no one had asked with enough patience to hear it, was that she had spent 7 years embedded with a reconnaissance unit in a geographic region that would still not be named in any public document. She had not been a soldier in the official sense. She had been attached as a civilian technical advisor, which was the language people used when they needed someone to do something that defied easy categorization. What she did was shoot, not often. That was the important part. She shot seldom, and only when everything that could be done without shooting had already been done. But when she shot, she did not miss. In 7 years, across 11 separate operations, she had fired a rifle in anger exactly 9 times. She had missed 0 of those 9 times. The distances had ranged from 800 meters to just over 2,900. She had done this under conditions that ranged from difficult to conditions that had no clean name. Then a man she loved had died, not in combat. In a hospital, with fluorescent lights overhead and a machine breathing for him, and she had held his hand and waited and then let go. And afterward, she had driven back to the small province where she was from, and she had stopped doing most things for a while. She farmed now. Specifically, she grew root vegetables on 8 acres of cold northern land that fought her constantly and rewarded her occasionally. She had a dog named Grim, who was old and missing part of one ear, and who slept on the foot of her bed every night with the certainty of something that had already decided to love her completely. She had entered the auxiliary program because a neighbor had mentioned it, and because she still had her certifications, and because something in her, some small persistent thing that the grief had not quite killed, had decided it was worth showing up. That was all. There was no grand intention. She simply showed up. When her name was called, there was no dramatic pause from her. She stood, picked up the case she had been sitting beside on the ground, and walked to the firing position without looking at the bleachers. The rifle she assembled was not new. It was a platform she had worked with before, heavily modified over years. Its stock fitted to the specific geography of her body, the length of her arms, the angle of her cheek, the way she breathed. A rifle, when it is truly known, becomes less a weapon and more a continuation of the body. She had not fired this specific configuration in 8 months, but she had maintained it. Because maintaining things, she believed, was how you honored what they once helped you survive. She lay down on the mat. General Voss watched from behind the observation line. He had said nothing when she walked out. He had looked at her the way a man looks at something he has not yet categorized, without hostility, but without expectation either. He was too experienced to be cruel about it. But he was also too experienced to pretend that what he saw, a middle-aged woman in plain clothes, assembling a rifle with quiet deliberateness, matched anything in the professional pattern he had spent 40 years building. Colonel Dre leaned close to a colleague and said something low and quiet. The colleague smiled briefly, then stopped smiling because Voss was nearby. Mara settled into the position. She was not dramatic about it. She did not roll her shoulders or crack her neck or perform any of the small rituals men use to signal their readiness to other men. She simply became still. It happened all at once. The stillness like a door closing softly in a house at night. Her spotter, a young lance corporal who had been assigned to her and who had never spotted for a woman before and was working hard not to make that visible, read her the wind data. Northeast component, 7 kilometers per hour at the firing line. The instrumental data from mid-range stations showed a shift at approximately 2,000 meters, where the corridor bent slightly around the ridge. The wind there was running counter, nor-northwest at roughly 12. At the target itself, the flags showed something close to still, but flags at that range lied constantly. Mara listened. She asked 2 questions. The lance corporal answered them. She nodded once, then stopped moving. There is a thing that happens in a human body when it commits to absolute stillness. When the conscious mind finally releases its grip on the muscles and surrenders to something older. Something trained so deep it no longer needs to be thought about. The breathing slows, not because you tell it to, because it knows. The heartbeat finds the spaces between its own rhythms. The eye behind the scope stops searching and starts receiving. Mara had been in this place before. She had been in it on a hillside 3 countries away, while a man she was responsible for protecting breathed quietly 10 meters behind her, and a wind she had never felt before moved through grass she didn't recognize. She had been in it the first time she pulled a trigger at distance and watched, through the scope, the moment of impact, and understood at once that she had a strange and heavy gift. The kind you spend the rest of your life figuring out how to carry. She thought briefly of the man who had taught her stillness. His name had been Oleg. He was gone now, and the fluorescent light above his bed had been the last thing she saw before she walked out of that hospital and drove north, and she had not been back to that kind of work since. But the stillness had stayed with her. You don't unlearn what lives in the body. The range fell quiet, not performatively quiet. Actually quiet, the kind that falls when even people who are skeptical become attentive, because something about the nature of the moment has forced them into it. She breathed out. She found the space. She pressed. The sound of a 4,000-meter shot is a strange thing. The report leaves the muzzle and rolls down the corridor and comes back slightly changed by the landscape. Then there is silence. Then the silence gets heavier. 4 seconds is a long time when everyone is counting it without counting it. The observers in the bleachers were doing a version of this, holding still without knowing they were holding still. The lance corporal's eye was against the spotting scope. He said nothing for 1 second, then 2. Then hit. It came out of him not like a professional report, but like something that surprised him, a word that escaped before he could shape it into the correct tone. Because what he was seeing in the scope, the center of the steel silhouette, struck clean, was something he had not fully prepared himself to see. Hit, he said again, steadying himself. General Voss lowered the field glasses he had raised without realizing he'd raised them. The bleachers were not loud. No one cheered. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before the shot. This one had texture. It had the quality of people revising something they had already decided. Voss looked at Dre. Dre was looking at the range. Mara was still in position, not because she was waiting for acknowledgement. Because getting up too quickly after a shot at distance was sloppy, and she was not sloppy. She stayed down and breathed and let the rifle's weight settle. And then, only when it was right, she sat back, opened the bolt, and began the quiet process of field clearing the chamber. Voss walked down from the observation point. He was not a man who walked quickly. He moved with the measured pace of someone who had learned long ago that urgency was often a form of theater, and he had no use for theater. He walked to the firing line, and he stood behind where she was kneeling beside her rifle, the case open. Each component returning to its place, with the practiced economy of someone who had done this more times than they could easily count. "Ma'am," he said. She looked up. Her face was not flushed. It was not performing anything. She simply looked at him the way you look at a person who has addressed you. "Sir," she said. "That was 4,000 meters," he said. "Yes." He studied her for a moment. Something was shifting in him, something that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with recognition. I asked at the start of the session if there were any experienced long-range shooters on the volunteer roster. The response I received was essentially no. She didn't answer immediately. She closed the case latch. Then she said, "I wasn't sure my kind of experience was what you were looking for." "What kind of experience is that?" She stood up. And he was struck, though he kept it from his face, by how completely unbothered she seemed. Not cold, not distant, just settled, like someone who had made peace with something large. "Field work," she said. 7 years, attached to a unit most people aren't allowed to reference by name. I was a technical advisor, which meant I held a rifle when rifles needed to be held. The range officer was approaching. Several of the observers from the bleachers had drifted closer, the way people drift toward things they're trying to understand without appearing too interested. Voss asked, "What was the unit?" She told him. Something crossed his face. It was gone in under a second, but it was there, a flash of deep, private recognition. The kind that happens when a name from a classified history surfaces in an unexpected place. He had been part of the oversight committee for that unit's operations. He had read every after-action report. He had signed documents relating to personnel whose real names were never in those documents. "The Northwest Corridor operations," he said slowly. 12 through 19. 14 through 21, she said, correcting him gently, not aggressively, just accurately. He stared at her. "Oleg," he said. The name came out like something he wasn't sure he should say aloud. The primary shooter on those operations, he went by Oleg. He stopped. He looked at her face more carefully now. "He died illness 4 or 5 years ago." 5, she said. The word landed softly between them and sat there. "You were with him," Voss said. It was not a question. "I was with him," she said. The weight of 5 years of grief is not something that shows on a person's face. It shows in the set of their jaw, in the slight permanent tension in the eyes, in the quality of their stillness. Voss had seen enough of that kind of grief to know it when he stood this close to it. He was quiet for a long moment. "In the reports," he said, "Oleg's success rate was documented across 11 field engagements, 9 confirmed shots, 9 confirmed impacts." He paused. It was considered one of the most extraordinary records in the program's history. "It was," she said. He let that sit. Then, the reports listed a second technical advisor. No name. Just a designation, Shadow 2. She didn't answer, she didn't have to. Harlan Voss, who had commanded divisions and buried people, and learned to sleep again after the decisions that cost lives. Harlan Voss stood at a firing line at the foot of a mountain ridge and understood, fully and without shortcut, what was standing in front of him. She had not been Oleg's assistant. She had not been his backup. She had been his equal, perhaps more. And the reason the reports listed her without a name was because she had asked for it that way. Because she was not interested in what names brought with them. He looked at the rifle case in her hand. He looked at the target 4,000 meters away, which his spotting team had now photographed and was currently documenting for the official record. He looked at the 13 men who had missed it, some of them still on the range, some of them watching from the bleachers. All of them at a different relationship with the last half hour than they had been before it began. Then he looked at her. "You knew," he said, "when I asked at the briefing whether anyone here had long-range experience. You knew and you didn't answer. You asked if there were any snipers," she said. "I was never designated a sniper. That was never my official classification." There was something almost painfully honest in that. She had not hidden behind it. She had simply remained inside the exact truth of it, the way a person who has nothing to prove can afford to remain inside exact truths. He breathed out slowly through his nose. "What do you do now?" he asked, and it was a genuine question, not a recruitment question, not a processing question, the question of a man who wanted to understand the shape of a life. "I farm," she said. He nodded. He did not smile at it or express anything that could be mistaken for condescension. He simply took it in. "Root vegetables," she added after a moment. And there was something in that, some tiny fragment of dry warmth that broke through the gravity of the exchange, not enough to lighten it, but enough to make it human. "That's hard work," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "so is this." She picked up her case. He did not stop her. He stepped back slightly, just enough to make the space hers. And as she walked back up the range, the lance corporal hurrying to gather the rest of the equipment, the observers parting quietly without quite knowing why they were parting, Voss watched her go. The men in the bleachers were silent, not with the silence of embarrassment, though some of that was present, with the silence of recalibration. The specific stillness that falls over people when they have witnessed something that does not fit neatly into the story they brought with them, and they are trying, without words, to make room for what actually happened. The wind shifted back to the northwest by noon. The range was packed up, the targets logged, the observers dispersed to their vehicles and their flights and their next appointments. The steel silhouette at 4,000 meters was retrieved and photographed, and would appear in a report that would be read by perhaps 15 people, none of whom would see the name Mara Venn attached to it, because she had declined to sign the release form for name-specific documentation. She was 3 hours north by the time the final report was filed. The dog was at the door when she arrived. Old Grim with his torn ear, who did not care where she had been or what she had done, or what any of it meant. He pressed his gray muzzle against her hand, and she stood in the cold air of the doorway for a moment, her fingers in his fur, and let the day settle into its place behind her. There is a kind of person who does not carry their extraordinary things loudly, not because they are hiding them, not because they are ashamed, but because the extraordinary thing is not the point. It never was. The point was the stillness, the breathing, the commitment to the exact truth of the space between the pull and the impact. The point was showing up. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be asked the right question. And some, the rarest kind, have already lived their answer quietly, in empty fields and cold mornings, and the long, patient work of aiming at a thing no one else could reach. She did not need the range. The range needed her, and that is the kind of thing that only becomes clear after the shot.